Gospel of Mark, whose original telling of the events of the Easter story we heard last Sunday preceded Matthew's version by a decade or so. And yet when Matthew told the Easter story, he included significantly more details. For example, as you heard Dottie read for us, Matthew mentions the earthquake that rolled the stone away from the entrance to the tomb. And he describes an angel who appeared like lightning sitting on top of it. And Matthew tells us about the guards who were petrified by fear. They were left speechless and powerless to act, much like dead men. And Matthew also says that Jesus himself gave the women the message, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my disciples to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." It was the risen Christ himself, not just some young messenger in a white robe, who commissioned Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to be his first preachers, the original Easter evangelists. Now, obviously, it's the same basic story that we talked about last week that was in Mark's gospel. But Matthew gives us more physical descriptions, he introduces more characters, and Matthew gives us a glimpse into some of the political background. In Matthew's gospel, we're allowed to listen in as the chief priests negotiate with Governor Pontius Pilate about posting guards at the tomb. Those secret meetings, those collusions between Jerusalem's civic and religious leaders and their Roman overlords are intended to derail Jesus' ministry. It sounds like what goes on among world politicians even in our own day. Secret meetings with collusions, derailing one person's candidacy over another. Seems it's in the news all the time. Though by the time Matthew's gospel was written, his nation, Judea, which had been so prosperous and secure in the days of Jesus, was by now, by Matthew's time, in great turmoil, because the Romans had waged a successful war against the Jewish Liberation Army, those zealot insurgents who had wanted Judean independence and autonomy. The Jewish nationalists in Jesus' day and thereafter were expecting a powerful political Messiah, someone who was sent by God to be the Savior of the nation, one who would rule from the throne of David as promised in the Bible, promised by the prophets. No, Jesus had come and gone years ago. So far as they were concerned, without fixing anything, Rome was still in charge. Herod is still on the throne. Oppression and poverty is still everywhere to be found. He had come and he had gone, and there was no big deal change. So they decided they'd take it into their own hands to expel the Romans by violence, by force. Since there were no outside allies in their day who were going to come and give the Jews aid in their insurrection, in their separatist nationalist agenda, the political powers of Caesar and the military might of the Roman legions simply crushed the Jewish rebellion. Even the last holdouts sequestered in the desert fortress of Masada were conquered in the end, and the Judaism of Jesus' day was forever changed. By the time Matthew wrote his book, the temple that Jesus knew was gone, reduced to a heap of rubble. The capital city of Jerusalem, which had such power and such glory, had been burned. The Arab old town that stands today was built on top of the mound of rubble and rock and ash of Jerusalem's former glory. The Jews desperately needed a resurrection of their faith. And Matthew's task, his hope, was to demonstrate that Jesus, the one that they had crucified 35, 40 years earlier, was in fact the long-awaited, God-sent Savior. He was the Redeemer that Israel had been offered, and was the one they still needed. Matthew wrote his version of the Jesus gospel in a setting in which hundreds of thousands of Jewish men had been killed in the bloody revolt against Rome, a war that lasted from the year 66 to the year 70. 4 years of a war in which hundreds of thousands of Jewish women and children became refugees in a world controlled by Caesar. The Jewish priests who had plotted against Jesus were all dead. The whole priesthood had been eliminated. The presence of God's holiness, which had been represented by that temple in Jerusalem, was no longer the center of their religion. Only one wall remained standing. It was the western wall of the Temple Mount. The Wailing Wall, it came to be called, because of all the tears and the prayers that were offered there in subsequent generations as the Jews continued to pray for the restoration of their temple, bringing back to Jerusalem, bringing back Israel. Only the widely scattered communities of rabbinic synagogues remained as havens for Jews in the Gentile world which surrounded them. These remnant, scattered Jewish people in their diaspora were the target audience for Matthew's gospel. And if you asked any of them, they would have said, this is the worst of times. Everything in the Jewish community that Israel had known and loved was lost. Everything they owned was gone. Everything they believed in had been dashed to pieces by the invading Roman army. It would have been somewhat like the horror of the Jewish Holocaust that was undertaken by the German Nazis during World War II. The people were left hopeless, helpless, hapless. Matthew wrote his version of the gospel not primarily to record for posterity the memories of the life and teachings of Jesus. After all, Mark in his gospel had already done that, and Matthew fully incorporated Mark's text in his own manuscript, verbatim. But rather, he wanted to reassure the scattered communities of Jewish believers that God's will could still be done on earth without resorting to a temple, without relying on the traditions of the elders that had been handed down to them. Without a priesthood, they could be God's followers faithfully without sacrifices, by relying on Jesus, who was God's anointed one, and following his way. That was Matthew's intent. That was Matthew's hope. Matthew's message was an important one, I believe, especially now that the political, economic, and ethnic homeland of the Jewish people was destroyed. The question he wanted his version to address is this: is it possible for God's will to be done after living through the destruction of one's native identity, one's basic national security, the loss for many people in the community of lives of loved ones? Is it possible that God's will can still be done when we've lost all the religious trappings and the cultural trappings of our people? Is a new beginning possible after one has seen the center of one's hopes consumed by death and witnessed your people overwhelmed with grief and loss? And if so, how is it possible to go on? See, in a world as consumed by wars as ours is, profoundly destructive wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, in Syria and Yemen, between the Israelis and the Palestinians, in several of the African nations, and now there's even talk of nuclear North Korea starting something. The question of whether or not it is possible that God's will can be done on earth after the destruction of one's national identity is more relevant than ever. The flood of refugees in these past few years that have been overwhelming Europe is a symptom of today's wars, but that was very real in Matthew's day as well. People were displaced because their homelands were no more. Well, I suppose one way that you can keep your culture alive, your national identity alive, your hope alive, is to wallow in grievances. You stoke relentlessly the resentment. You keep the memory of what's been lost fresh by keeping the pain alive, by retelling over and over every time you gather the horror, even though you know that telling is going to further infect the venom of bitterness and resentment into later generations. You know, for a lot of folks, they can't help it. After all, these are the people that you're to blame for what's happened to you. You name them and you blame them, and that gets your base all stoked up. You can win elections if you can name and blame the right, wrong people. You retell the stories of injustice that you have had, that your people have suffered. You emphasize the need to retaliate. You emphasize the need, perhaps tinged with a taste of revenge, until there's an appropriately apocalyptic moment that coalesces, in which the next generation is allowed to rise up and renew the battle in hopes of restoring what used to be. Give them a chance to pay them back. Now, I wonder, is it even possible to fight the wars of one's ancestors? How can anybody win their grandparents' war? And how sad a choice that is, how destructive in the long run. And yet how common it is to have that reaction. Resentment for what you've lost and desire for retaliation. Revenge becomes the promised sweet fruit whenever seeds of resentment are buried alive. Matthew and the early church that he represents, the Christian movement in Judaism, takes a different approach to all that grief and all that loss and all that death and all that destruction. And they say, in effect, it doesn't matter. Even the crucifixion of Jesus didn't stop anything. You get over it and you get on with it. Period. The death of Jesus was just a 3-day glimpse